All right, so Airbnb has had a hard time when it comes to making all of its users feel welcome. In fact, if you do a search on Twitter for hashtag Airbnb while black, you'll be pummeled by story after story of Airbnb hosts canceling the reservation request of someone who was likely nothing more than not white. Joining us to talk about this is Charles Pulliam-Moore, writer for Fusion. How's it going, Charles?
I'm fantastic. How are you, Jason?
Doing great. It's great to get you back here. Tell us a little bit about how Airbnb has kind of gained its reputation for not being welcome to minorities, to blacks who are trying to use the service.
So a couple of months ago, a lot of Black Airbnb users took to Twitter with the hashtag Airbnb while black to sort of share their experiences with the service. And what people sort of quickly recognized was that there was a pattern, right, that was sort of pretty standard throughout everyone's different story. So it's usually a person is looking to go somewhere, they log on to Airbnb looking for a spot. They find somewhere that is available within the time frame that they're looking to be in that particular location. They book it, the booking goes through, everything is sort of set. But then within a couple of hours, they get a cancellation from the owner of the location. And the reasons why were pretty much always like, oh, you know, I haven't updated my my availability calendar in so long, I'm sorry, which is a valid thing, you know. If you aren't like a frequent renter through Airbnb, there's a chance that, you know, your plans can change and you're not necessarily on your calendar all the time. But what people sort of quickly found out was that that was pretty much like the standard script. Like, oh, you know, I didn't update my calendar on time. My bad. And it happens so often that people eventually, you know, ask their white friends, like, hey, well, like, will you try booking this for me just to see, you know, just to see if the booking goes through? And as luck would have it, a lot of people saw that the bookings went through without any kind of hitch.
That's a challenge, to say the least. What's someone's recourse if they feel that their reservation's being treated this way? Or do they have any?
So technically speaking, all you can really do is report it to Airbnb. You can say, hey, you guys, this thing happened. I got turned away, you know, and I sort of followed up with a white friend of mine, and they seem to get it. And so there seems to be some kind of conflict going on. But Airbnb has taken the position with a number of users that says that unless there is a specific instance in which the renter or the Airbnb user has explicitly said something discriminatory against you, and you can prove it, you don't really have that much ground to stand on. So Airbnb, you know, when pushed, will talk about specific instances where they've gone after users who have been discriminatory. There are two users in particular, one who discriminated against a black man by, you know, calling him epithets, and another trans woman whom was very obviously discriminated against, again, like explicitly. Airbnb will hold those two up as sort of being emblematic of their stance on discrimination, but that sort of doesn't really deal with the way that harassment online works, right? It's not always so black and white, for lack of a better term.
Well, so, I mean, the Civil Rights Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act says you can't discriminate against race for any public accommodation, including hotels.
Yeah.
So why isn't Airbnb held to this same standard?
So again, like I said, like it's really difficult to prove discrimination all the time. It's not always, there's so many steps that you have to take to sort of establish, no, this is the reason that I was turned away, right? And then even still, it becomes sort of like like an I said, they said, right? But then there's this added layer to it where Airbnb users, when they sign up for the service, part of the terms and conditions says that you are barred from entering into a class action lawsuit should any issues arise. And if you look back historically, in instances where there's been sort of like institutional discrimination against women, people of color, people of various religious backgrounds, people of various gender expression, it's always been through class action lawsuits that people have been able to get legal recourse because it's so. You know, one of the pernicious things about institutional discrimination is that it doesn't always manifest itself in the same exact form, right? So someone may call you a name, someone may turn you away. Some people, you know, it could be something as simple as like, oh, like I signed up for your Airbnb, and when I got there, you left it, you know, in a state of ridiculous disarray that would make me not want to stay there. All three of those are instances, or could be instances of discrimination, but because people aren't allowed to sort of like pool their experiences and present them to a judge, it makes it much more difficult for people to sort of make a solid case for themselves.
It's one of those moments where, the sharing economy, which is a dumb name for it, but it's not.
We're sharing. I'm paying you to share.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And they're not very good at sharing. But, we look at it and we think, oh, this is so great. I don't have to stay in a hotel. Where everything's free and not free, but, we're just doing this our own way. But then these regulations that have been in place are no longer in place. And we see it again and again, with Uber and with so many of these new companies. And so what do you make of that?
I mean, it's sort of, we always talk about disruption disruption has become a sexy word in the Valley, right? And it's like, oh, like I'm doing something different, which is true. But with disruption, it's not just necessarily a disruption of the business model. It's a disruption of some of the legal protections, the social mores that have been put in place, over decades, because these problems aren't new. Like, it's not so long ago that, Black people just weren't allowed certain places. Through a number of court battles, we were able to sort of put sanctions in place that made it, that made that illegal and discouraged people from it. But we always talk about how, startup culture is the Wild West. And this is an instance of how that can be problematic at times. Because when people have pushed back against Airbnb, and they're very resolute that what they're doing is the right thing, right? That idea of, or rather that provision of barring people from being able to file class actions, that is sort of like de rigueur in the Valley, not necessarily just for users, but for employees, right? Just sort of it has sort of become a standard. And so there's this clashing of ideologies where it's on the one hand, you have Valley types who feel as if, this is our culture, this is how we do business. And on the other hand, you have the public being like, nah, this is not great. This, causes harms upon people.
So then, kind of moving from there where Airbnb has kind of failed, Phoenix rises out of the ashes with inclusivity in mind. Tell us about Rohan Gilks and his business Innclusive.
Yeah, so Rohan actually wrote a piece for Fusion about his experiences with Airbnb. He had a very traditional Airbnb while Black story, was looking to go rent out a cabin in a pretty white area, got denied. But rather than just sort of taking to Twitter and expressing his outrage, he's like, well, let's build something, let's build an alternative. Initially, it was called Noir B&B with a focus on bringing Black people into the fold. But in a recent conversation I had with him, he's like, no, I've gotten so many letters from people of various backgrounds. It's not just ethnic discrimination. It's not just racial discrimination. It's also people being discriminated against based on their gender expression. And so Noir B&B evolved into Innclusive with two N's, cute little pun. And the way that he explained it to me, it's basically just like Airbnb, right? Except that it has protections built in place that penalize users that sort of engage in the kind of discriminatory behavior that you've seen on Airbnb. So on Airbnb, right, I can list this office space as being rentable, right? I say it's available on X date. You try to book it for X date, and then I can say, oh no, something's happened. Family emergency, I didn't update my calendar, what have you. That's completely legit, right? Things happen. But what Innclusive will do is that it puts a freeze on that location, right? It says that if you actually had a legitimate reason as to why that space is no longer available, you probably don't need to be renting it out, right? It's not, an unfairly long amount of time, but it's just enough to say that, listen, if you, cancel this booking because you don't like the person that tried to book it, you really shouldn't be on our platform. And it's those kinds of protections that I feel like Airbnb should learn from, because it's not going out of its way to do the heavy duty work of scouring. It's not going to go into people's private communications. It's not going to go into their profiles and scan everything. It really is just creating a culture that discourages that kind of discrimination.
Yeah, creating a layer that would hopefully, have someone think twice about doing that versus just it being wide open and there being no restrictions. Speaking of restrictions, are there any restrictions for who can use Innclusive, or is it still open to everyone?
No, in our conversation, Ron was telling me, initially we were really marketing this heavily towards Black people. But he's like, no, there are a lot of stories about people who are completely down with the cause. They're like, no, I'm open to having anyone here. So Innclusive isn't necessarily just about racial inclusion. It's just about inclusion overall. home sharing, if it sharing, sharing as a part of the name, we want to make this something that is accessible to all people, which is really cool.
Cool. When is this launching? Because I know it hasn't launched publicly yet, right?
No, it's currently in beta. You can sign up for an invite now. Last I spoke with her, and it's actually launching within the next 4 to 6 weeks. So if you sign up for the notification, you will be one of the first to find out about, everything is going to go live.
Excellent. INN, inclusive.
INN, yes.
Oh, that's awesome.